Okay. Hello, everyone. So welcome to the second session of the Academy Online. This is the book club discussion that will look at B.F. Skinner's 1948 novel, Walden 2. I'm Alistair Donald of the Battle of Ideas charity. My co-host for this session is Jeff Kidder, the CEO of the charity. So if anything happens at any point over the next hour and a quarter and I go missing, if my broadband fails or whatever, then Jeff will take over running of this session. When we were developing the program for today, we wanted to retain the tradition of the Academy running some sessions in parallel that give smaller groups of people the opportunity to dig into some of the issues thrown up by the theme of psychology and democracy in a bit more depth. And this year it seemed that a very useful way of doing that would be to run a series of book clubs. And it's worth saying that although Walden 2 is over 70 years old now, there are lots of contemporary resonances that are worth at least holding on to in the back of our minds. Obviously, there's been interest recently in how psychological techniques can shape the behavioral response in the context of the pandemic of coronavirus. But we've also seen something of a renewed interest in experimental utopias. So you've only got to see the number of articles in recent days that have attempted to place the Seattle Autonomous Zone within the context of experimental utopian tradition, not to mention the ongoing discussion and interest and fascination in entrepreneurs, especially tech companies, who want to set up self-governing spaces outside of mainstream society. Also worth noting the popularity of TV series such as Devs, which again is kind of tech utopia that reflects on questions of behavior and free will and determinism, etc. So I think that we can see that this discussion that is a useful opportunity to both reflect on Skinner and his work and what was going on at the time, but also some of the more contemporary developments of today. So let me introduce our speaker. It's Dr. Helene Guldberg. Helene is a lecturer in psychology at the Open University. She's the author of 2 books, Childhood, Freedom and Play in an Age of Fear, and Just Another Ape. She's a regular speaker at the Battle of Ideas Festival and also a regular and insightful reviewer in a number of magazines and journals, including the magazine Spite, which she co-founded 20 years ago. And in the past 3 or 4 months, Helene, it's worth saying, I think, has played, been playing a key role in community networks within Birmingham and setting up responses to the pandemic. So a kind of interesting range of experiences that Helene, I think, can bring to this discussion. The format, Helene will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll come straight out to you all for your contributions, whether that be questions or thoughts. So Helene, I'm going to make sure that you're unmuted.
I don't think I'm muted, am I?
No, you're not. And I'm going to spotlight you, and it's over to you. Okay,
so cards on the table, first of all. I think Walden 2 is an absolutely dreadful book. The dialogue is excruciatingly awful, I think. It's absolutely dire. The ideas are mundane, dull as ditch water, and the characters are all one-dimensional, completely uninteresting, which actually I think is quite apt because it sort of sums up what the society Walden 2 would be like. And the world that Skinner sees as a utopia, because he sees Walden 2 as a utopia, to me and very many people would be a dystopia. So it's a world that is soulless, it's lacking in freedom and spontaneity, it's lacking in agency, individual human agency, it's lacking in moral autonomy. In the world that Skinner wants, there could be no intimacy, no true intimacy or loyalty. And it's a world lacking in meaning. So it's a sanitized, dull world. And similarly, I think Brave New World in 1984 present some similarities in terms of the world of utter conformity, where the human spirit is broken in Huxley's book and in Orwell's book, and freedom is squashed. But Huxley and Orwell So this is something to be dreaded. And Skinner saw it as something positive. Apparently with his students, he put both Brave New World and his own book on the reading list. Whether he actually thought that Huxley saw it as this world as something positive like he did or not, I'm not sure. But in Walden 2, Skinner boasts that through the protagonist, Fraser, that no history will be taught. Now, to me, this is really, really telling, because I think you cannot have civilization without an appreciation of history and some grounding in tradition. You cannot have human aspirations, a belief in progress, a sense of belonging, or find meaning if there's not a rejection of history. And I think there's a really beautiful quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote an essay on what is history. And he was a good friend of Henry David Thoreau's. And Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden, which Walden 2 was inspired by. I'm going to say something about that later. But there's a lovely quote where he says, "There is one mind common to all individual men. Every man is an inlet to the same and to all the same. He that is once admitted to the right of reason is made a freeman of the whole estate. What Plato has thought, he may think. What a saint has felt, he may feel. What at any time was befallen any man, he can understand. Who hath access to the universal mind is party to all that is and can be done. For this is the only sovereign agent. Man is explicable by nothing less than all his history." Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing in the mid-19th century at the same time as Henry David Thoreau. But in Walden 2, there is no history. So, you know, to me, the individuals as part of this community would be utterly unanchored in the way that Lash describes in The Culture of Narcissism. Neither is there any politics in Walden 2. And here I think Aristotle's claim that a man that does not live in a polis is not human. A man without politics is not human. A man without politics is either above humans or below humans. So in other words, a man without politics is either a god, because they didn't need politics, or a beast. So what I want to look at in the 15 odd minutes I've got left is what's briefly Skinner's influences and who he was influenced by, some background to behaviorism. I don't know how familiar you are with behaviorism, some limitations of the research, and then drawing out the main points of Walden 2. So on Skinner and his influences, although Skinner's ideas were extremely influential in psychology for much of the 20th century, his book that was written, as Alistair said, 1948, initially only sold about 700 copies a year. But by the 1970s, it was selling about 250,000 a year. And the reason for the title Walden is because it builds on Henry Thoreau's 1854 novel, Walden. Which I thought I'd better read in advance of this. According to Skinner, Walden is a utopia for one, and Thoreau's Walden is a utopia for one. Skinner's book is Walden 2, it's a utopia for a community. I think from what I remember, it's 1,000, he was saying, the maximum. But Thoreau wrote about the utopia you find through escaping into the wilderness and through self-reflection, through reading, and particularly he emphasized reading the classics, reading ancient Greeks, and appreciating the beauty of nature. And it's a much, much more interesting book, a lot better written, some beautiful descriptions of nature there. But I would disagree with Thoreau's message as well. But if anybody put a gun to my head and said, where would you want to live, Walden or Walden 2, I would choose Walden, even though you'd be living, you know, in sort of splendid isolation, although he had some contact with people. But you would at least then recognize the importance of drawing upon ideas from history, which Thoreau recognized. And it would, to me, would be far better than living in a stultifying world where human beings basically are treated like sheep. And according to Skinner, you know, they therefore behave like sheep, and he thinks it's a good thing. So what is behaviorism? B.F. Skinner was influenced by Pavlov, who put forward the idea of classical conditioning. So what Pavlov showed was that if you take an unconditioned stimulus, the bell, and you pair that with a conditioned stimulus, which is the smell of meat, then you get an conditioned response, which is salivation. So the pairing of two stimuli results in a response. B.F. Skinner's conditioning is not referred to as classical conditioning. It's often referred to operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And what he argued instead is that organisms act upon the world, and the way in which they act upon the world will be very much shaped by evolution. So you act upon the world, but learning takes place on the basis of whether, once you act upon the world, whether that's positively or negatively reinforced. And this simple rule shapes all of human behavior, according to Skinner. Now, he has provided some interesting insights into how animals learn and can be trained. But I would argue even this is not that revolutionary, because people who for centuries have worked in circuses have learned that animals can be trained to do quite ingenious things through reward and punishment. So that was not that new. Can conditioning or behaviorism explain human behavior? I would say some aspects, yes. So if you take classical conditioning, anybody who's been a smoker may find, if you are used to, say, when you're out for a drink, having a cigarette, and that's when you really enjoy the cigarettes, you have two stimuli, two together, alcohol, cigarette. If you then stop smoking, you then have the alcohol, you get a burning urge to have a cigarette, and it becomes very difficult not to have one. And that's an unconscious process that has an impact on us. So yes, it can explain something. I think it can explain some phobias and dislikes. For instance, for a while, I couldn't smell red wine without feeling nauseous. And that was because one afternoon, I was on holiday with my dad, and I said I wasn't feeling quite right. And he said, have a glass of wine, that'll perk you up. It was often his medicine for any ailments. And within an hour, I was violently sick. Now, not because of the wine, I had contracted norovirus. But in that association then of red wine and nausea then stuck with me, which meant that I couldn't smell red wine without feeling nauseous for a long time. So some behaviors it can explain. Anybody who's had small children who's used star charts know that they can be quite useful at times to get rid of unwanted behaviors and to encourage particular behaviors. But as children get older, they become far more difficult to manipulate. It becomes far more difficult to manipulate children. And for instance, you know, these reward and punishment is something that's often tried in prisons with limited success, because we become quite adept at manipulating these kinds of things. But I would, and this did come up in this morning's discussion, I would say that it is possible to manipulate human beings to some extent, possibly through reward and punishment, but it's really limited. And particularly because we are conscious agents who can choose to stop and think and reflect on how we're being manipulated. So I know that when I go shopping, I'm manipulated, but I don't care. But if I did care, then I would have the capacity to sort of stop and reflect on this. So yes, some aspects it can explain, but it is limited. On the limitations of the research, Skinner's research is incredibly limited. All of his research was done on rats, looking at how they find food in mazes, or pigeons. I say it's limited in understanding human beings, But his experiments were actually really quite ingenious. And if anybody wants to look at any of them, you can see them on YouTube. He could teach pigeons to play ping pong, to play keyboards, and such like. But it's incredibly limited because it tells us almost nothing about human beings. But there is still sort of research being done within psychology on conditioning, and one of the areas is evaluative conditioning. So that involves manipulating people's attitudes to certain stimuli. So for instance, you might manipulate attitudes to high sugar content food or high fat content food. And so, you know, these lab experiments might then pair up pictures of high sugar content food with an ugly picture of a big fat belly. And from that, they've found that they've been able to some extent manipulate implicit attitudes to particular foodstuffs, which they then measure through surveys and such like after. But also, to some extent, they can manipulate attitudes, manipulate actual choices as well around food. So in one of the experiments at the end, after their attitude to particular foods had been manipulated, the participants were given the choice saying, oh, a reward for taking part in the experiment, you can choose a little basket with fruit in it, or you can choose a little basket with sweets in it. And more people, no more participants in the experimental group chose the little basket with fruit in it than sweet, more in the experimental group than in the control group. But what I would say from this is that all we know from this is that manipulating people's attitudes to particular things, stimuli, can have some short-term effect maybe on your attitude and maybe even on choices. But none of these experiments tell us whether these changes are lasting. There's very little evidence of that. And also, you know, there's so much research going on in psychology now that shows that the relationship between our attitudes and our behavior are actually a lot more complex than previously thought. So, you know, there are many things that we might, our attitude might be that we see it as something negative, bad for your health, smelly, dirty, like smoking. I don't think very many see it as really cool and glamorous anymore, but so there's lots of negative connotations, but we still do that. So it's a lot more complex, that relationship between attitudes and behavior. Also, these studies have very low ecological validity, in the sense that the way people behave in a experimental lab, artificial, highly controlled setting will be very different from the way we behave in the real world, where there are so many other influences. Now, in psychology, there's a real obsession in psychology in presenting psychology as a science. And B.F. Skinner argued that psychology is only a science if it measures things that are observable. Now, this is not unique to behaviorists or to Skinner. The emphasis on measuring things that are observable in order to get an insight into the human mind is very much because wanting to put psychology on a scientific footing, and very much a reaction against Freud. So you can only measure the mind or get any insight into the mind by looking at behavior. Now, I do think it is true that you can actually get lots of insights into the human mind by looking at behavior, and Piaget could tell us a lot about children's minds through looking indirectly at behavior. But Skinner went a lot further than this, because what he argued is not just that the mind is not observable, he says the mind is an illusion. Free will is an illusion. We don't have free will. The only thing that we should be interested in is behavior, and behavior is shaped by reinforcement. It is not shaped by the mind. So I think it was Alistair said he's a radical behavior. Somebody said he's a radical behavior. So he is. I mean, he's the extreme end of behaviorism, utterly deterministic. But for much of the 20th century, he was one of the most eminent psychologists. Although today I would say very few psychologists would call themselves behaviorists. And there is a recognition within psychology that behavior is a lot more complex than Skinner made out. And I do think it's important to differentiate between the psychology that makes its way into sort of policy circles and research that's going on within psychology, because there is actually a lot of quite interesting research going on within psychology. So the main points of Walden 2. Key is behavioural control. So what Skinner's basically saying is not that he's proposing a world in which human beings are controlled. That's not unique about Walden 2, because we are controlled anyway. We are controlled by priests, by advertising, by demagogues. So we're already controlled by our environment. But the aim of Walden 2 is to have the good guys, you know, setting the rules and ensuring that we're controlled positively rather than negatively in order to achieve health and well-being. But, you know, when you read the book, his ideas about how to change behavior are just so, it's embarrassing. They're just so utterly uninspiring. So he says, you know, we're meant to get really excited about the shift work for cooking, eating and cleaning. And Fraser, or Fraser, I don't know how to pronounce it, the protagonist says, an amazing piece of cultural engineering, the staggered schedule. The fact is almost unbelievable. We need less equipment of all sorts. Bathrooms, for example, if you have ever stayed at a summer hotel which didn't have private baths, you remember the shaving hour and dinner hour rushes. With a staggered schedule, we get along with limited installations quite conveniently. Wow, I mean, how exciting about, you know, a utopian world. You don't have to queue for the bathroom. There will be no politics or democracy. Second point in that's really emphasized in Walden 2. So individuals should be entirely subordinated to the rules of community. And he says an important theme of Walden 2 is that political action is to be avoided. In other words, there should be no dialogue, debate, involvement by the community at large in decisions about how their society should be run. And Fraser says, of course, they can have some input. As to disagreements, says Fraser, the protagonist, anyone who examines the evidence upon which the rule was introduced into the code, he may argue against its inclusion and may present his own evidence. If the managers refuse to change the rule, he may appeal to the planners, but in no case must he argue about the code with members at large. There's a rule against that. So no debate, but if you're not happy with the code, you can sort of scientifically put your case to the controller or the planner or whatever they're called, and it can be considered, but without any community debate around it. And he boasts about this. Maximizing health is key to Walden 2. And this sort of absolute focus on health, I think is reading it, you know, during the coronavirus crisis is a little bit unsettling. So it's very sterile life that he proposes here. And some of the practices that he promotes for keeping individuals and community free from disease is minimizing crowds, isolating infants, so you reduce the spread of infection. And then there's all this emphasis on, you know, strengthening the immune system through physical exercise and nutritious meals. So the emphasis very much is on individuals who are content and healthy. Reminds me very much of Brave New World. There's no education. So since our children remain happy, energetic, curious, we don't need to teach subjects at all, he says. We teach only the techniques of learning and thinking, which may sound familiar to some of you. The other thing is the elimination of negative emotions. And this is where I would argue, therefore, if the aim is to eliminate negative emotions, you cannot have intimacy, because intimacy means, you know, taking risk with emotions. One of his aspirations is get rid of emotions such as jealousy, anger, and fear. So only the good, productive, and strengthening emotions such as joy and love. But I would argue you can have love. If you're only going to have positive emotions, you're not going to have love, because the whole process of developing intimacy does always involve a range of human emotions. So I think Shakespeare's shown us quite clearly. But yes, his emphasis is entirely on just positive emotions. It sort of adds to the soullessness, I think, of Walden too. Undermining the Family is another thing, and this seems to come up in a lot of sort of utopian novels. Plato admired Sparta, with its getting rid of the family as well. And I think Moore did it in Utopia, I think, but now I've forgotten. It's not that long ago I read it. So even marriage and love will be an outcome of behavioral science, he says. So he says, Fraser again, then let me add a scientific touch. When a young couple become engaged, they go to our manager of marriages, their interests, school records and health are examined. If there's any great discrepancy in their intellectual ability or their temperament, then they're advised against marrying. So the marriage love has to become then a scientific process. And parenting, he wants to get rid of parents as well. And he says that wonderful things can be done in the first years of life, but we leave them to people whose mistakes range from all the way from child abuse to overprotection and lavishing the affection on wrong behavior, which I suppose relates to Frank's point about the emphasis becomes in a utopia on molding and shaping children from an early age. And interestingly, in Sparta as well, the family unit was undermined. Lots of emphasis on breaking any loyalty other than to fellow fighters. So the elders decided which infants could live and which infants should be left to die. That was not the decision of parents. Males, even once they were married, would spend far more time in the barracks with their fellow fighters and would eat with them, not with the family. And the aim was really to destroy any source of loyalty to anybody other than their fellow fighters. And the entire raison d'etre for Spartans was as fighters. That's what they were trained up to be. But yet at the same time, they very often try to avoid fighting, because they did not want to leave Sparta to go and fight in different parts of the world, because they were in constant fear of an uprising from the helots, from the slaves. So to me, everything I've learned about ancient Greece, Sparta is not in any way an inspiring polis. There's nothing inspiring about Sparta. But so much of Walden too reminded me of Sparta with the really Spartan way of life. He emphasizes that we need few belongings. He's against consumerism, the undermining of the family, the utter conformity, obedience, minimal dialogue and debate, and minimal education. So the Spartans didn't get an education either, apart from physical education. So in conclusion, quickly, I think there's little evidence that much of human behavior is shaped by conditioning. It can explain some aspects of our behavior, but the way we learn is qualitatively different from animals. And for those of you not read Just Another Ape, my book, I go through how different human learning is from animal learning, just to get a little plug in. A world organized by behavioral science, secondly, I would say, where democracy is removed and behavioral outcomes are manipulated, is a really cold, sanitized, uninspiring world where I think human beings become passive and dull in a world where they are not expected to make any choices or exercise any judgment. And I think if you compare this to community, or not the community, but the polis of Athens under Pericles, where you're active citizenship, where everybody was, not everybody, but everybody could be involved in the assemblies. Up to 40,000 citizens could take part in the assemblies, and at least 6,000 would regularly, because that's what they needed for them to be quorate, would take part in these assemblies. Many of them would be then selected to sit for 1 year on the Council of 500, to where they'd have to take part in drafting legislation. They would take part in the juries of 501, where there would be no judges, no expert directing the procedures. They would hold public offices by lot. So here you have people who were forced to make important decisions, take themselves seriously, take education seriously, and that active citizenship is just a world apart from the dull conformity that we would get under Skinner. And very finally, it's a really negative, pessimistic view of human beings who, you know, can be so easily manipulated and their spirit broken and freedom squashed, which Skinner sees as a really good thing. And I would say, in some way, although Huxley sees this as a bad thing, his is a dystopia, I would also say that he similarly has quite a negative view of human beings, because he thinks, or it seems through Brave New World anyway, that he thinks that actually human beings can be manipulated through consumerism and through technology. Whilst I'm with Orwell, very final point, 1984, where he also shows the human spirit is broken, but he shows it's bloody hard to break the human spirit. So extreme measures are needed: surveillance, terror, torture, fomenting divisions, and getting children to report on their parents. I think I've overrun slightly.
Thanks very much, Helena. That was incredibly useful, I think. So much packed into 20 minutes there. So I'm going to throw it over to discussion now. You feel free to ask about anything. Some people might want to defend the book and take Helena up. That's perfectly okay. We might want to talk about some of the detail that Helena's mentioned in terms of the behavioral sciences and the psychology, how much use they are, how much they overclaim. We might want to look at things like the continuity between some of the other people that Helena mentioned, Freud, Huxley, and so on, and what the continuities and differences were. But it's really an open discussion, so over to you for your points and questions. So I'm going to take Niall Crowley first.
Hi.
Oh, it's Jason, yes.
Hey. Yeah, so I don't want to defend the book as such, because it was really quite a difficult read. I read it after a book by another psychologist, Philippe Grimbold, called Secret, which was fantastic. So I had high hopes for Walden too, but the descriptions and the dialogue are, there's a reason why novelists are novelists, right? But I'd like to defend some of the ideas though. It's or at least the desire behind it, because what there is in his description, the desire is to create a more ordered, efficient society, and that's surely a positive thing. And what's missing, as Helena has pointed out, is the life of the mind, and also maybe a distinction between the mind and the soul, which is interesting and perhaps a little bit weird for a psychologist. But also he foresees the progressive turn in education of the kind of policies for the 60s, 60s and 70s, i.e. we don't teach subjects, we teach pupils how to learn, think, critical thinking, and citizenship, for instance. And that's a description largely of a lot of the UK education system now, and it's certainly a description of teacher training. And at the same time, though, in terms of the way he is talking about child rearing, which I think is probably the most interesting aspect, it's a system of socialised childcare, which many of us, not so long back, thought was a very good idea. So, you know, and just on the point about behaviourism, although behaviourism itself might not be the thing that psychologists and counsellors are particularly up for now, what is the biggest thing is cognitive behavioural therapy. So a combination of cognitive therapy and behavioural therapy, which is very much all the rage. If you go, if you get referred to a psychologist or a counsellor on the NHS, you will get a short course of CBT, and that is about making people aware of their conscious behaviour and thoughts in order to change them. So it seems that some of the ideas that Skinner talked about might not be very popular, but certainly his influence, among with others, is very much felt.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So I'm going to bring Para in now. So Para.
Okay, so it's a bit similar to what Jason ended up in with that question, really, because what I'm interested in is contemporary, how much has his Skinner's views are, you know, influenced by contemporary discussions and adoption of, you know, ways of being, because even though the same terminology and language might not be used, I kind of think that some of the influences, exactly what Jason just talked about, cognitive therapy, or even that whole nudge discussion, you kind of feel that there are elements of it which have pretty much kind of been influenced, perhaps not by Skinner, but given what you've just talked about, it does appear as if, you know, we're in a situation where those kind of influences are happening.
Okay, thanks, Para. So Josephine, I'm going to bring you in now.
Hi, thank you, Helena. That was very interesting. As I was reading the book, I felt like it was describing school, and particularly primary school. I know Jason said, you know, the kind of a 70s desire to sort of teach critical thinking and that, but I think something that's happened at school really kind of pulls on a lot of the things that are in the Walden 2 community. So, for example, the focus on health, the discussion of what we do as teachers nowadays, and you know, if you look at the debate about reopening schools, heads are going, we're working really, really hard. What they're doing is they're working hard to clean their school, to write risk assessments, to take packages of work to vulnerable children, to organise free school meals. There's no discussion of education at all. And basically the kind of intimacy that you were talking about has been removed from school totally by the policies that have been brought in. So you look at the Daily Mile, everyone has to do the Daily Mile because we need to keep our children healthy. It doesn't matter that I work in a school in the middle of a middle-class village where the children are all really skinny, and that the policy was developed in Scotland in a school where maybe there was a need for a bit more physical education. But we've just got to all do it because it's good for our children. No discussion, no context. Well-being. We had a training session on well-being, and we had to read a book, and one of the things that it suggested you could do with your colleagues if you felt that your colleague looked like their well-being wasn't doing very well is make up a little package, put it on their desk with a little note to say that you're thinking of them. You know, what's happened to the days where you go up to somebody and say, you don't look very happy, are you okay? You know, it's kind of removed that intimacy by putting these policies in place. Child protection is another one. You have to fill in a form. You have to have so many instances before you can act on it. And when you do act on it, the child is taken out of the process completely. It's a complete technocratic experience, which is why children die. And then we get more technocratic experiences on top of that. I really, you know, Daniel in the chat said, why are we discussing it? And I think it's because we are actually, it feels very much like we're living it. And there are a lot of these influences today. You know, Orwell talked about extreme processes, but, you know, just the announcement of a journey maker today really made me think about 1984. You know, these journey makers, they're not helping you make a journey. They're making sure you wear a mask. So it's true doublespeak. And then just finally, in education, there is no critical thinking in primary school, I don't feel anymore. You know, there's a Twinkle Society where we pull things off there, plastics in the ocean, Greta Thunberg. And I watch teachers on the Twitter feed who are parts of the groups that I'm involved in, who just pick up on the latest trend without any critical thinking at all. So I really do worries me that primary schools really are kind of little Walden 2 communities or developing into them.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. So I'm going to bring in Kerry now, and then I'm going to come back to Helene after that for if you want to respond to anything, Helene, and then I'll come back out for another round of questions. So Kerry, off you go.
Thank you for that, Helena. I actually enjoyed reading it. I don't want to defend the book, but I just thought it was a very quick read and quite funny, if not scary at times. I agree with you on all its horrible conformity and disbelief in human agency and autonomy and its unfreedom and anti-democratic, anti-politics implications. But I was interested in Skinner's motivation, and he did seem to be someone who comes out of that immediate post-war period as someone who wants to look at the good society. And it is interesting to note that there were, if you look at another book called Living Walden, I think there were directly an immediate about 24 different attempts to set up a Walden 2 type scenario, mostly in America and one in Mexico, and later another 30 or so more, I think around 200 all in, that we rarely hear about, these kind of probably hippie commune type experiments. And I couldn't find anywhere Walden, Skinner himself really talking about these actual experiments that had gone ahead. It's clear that as a novel, it's very weak as a novel. It's really a thesis that he's laying out. And Castle and Burgess, you know, Castle as the philosopher and Burgess as someone who, you know, turns and goes back and joins Walden 2 in the end. Castle is just the, you know, nemesis. It's just the excuse to have the argument against philosophy and against humanity. And Castle's a pretty shitty, not very compelling figure himself. Yet there are some positives in the sense that in that period, you notice what is radical is his belief in women shouldn't be stuck in the home, for example, in his condemnation of what he calls housewifery. But really what he then does is condemn everybody to housewifery rather than anything more radical than that. And so it is very boring. I think Jason's got a point when you look at his idea of technology and efficiency and working only 4 hours a day, because there is that drive to give people more leisure time, although it seems to be fairly stultified and over-organized. He also has a belief in a cultural golden age, which hasn't happened. And that's why he has Burgess reflecting on all the great art that these automatons somehow, with no belief in history or anything else, somehow managed to produce, which is quite interesting. So I think we can see in his motivations things that are positive and his aspirations for peace, even though maybe they're disingenuous, because, you know, when he's talking about his experiments, or maybe it was a lecture somewhere else on his experiments, his pigeons he used were used by the sort of I don't know, the military to test out guided missiles. So you kind of doubt whether, and apparently still he had one of those even in his dying days in his basement, one of these guided missiles with pigeons in that tap on certain screens to make them work. So you even have to you maybe have to doubt his pacifism in some way.
Last point, Kerry.
Okay, last point. I mean, overall, I think Helene has summed it up very well, but I do think we could look at the context a bit more. And for me, finally, I saw it as akin to the institutions today, which hold people in absolute contempt. And like the planners and managers that Skinner talks about in Walden 2, want to guide everything we do.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. And that point about looking that you made at the end there about looking at the context of the book at the time. I mean, I was reading it and it struck me as nothing less a description of what was going on in Sweden at the time. It seemed to be have an incredible be an incredible reflection on some of the kind of disruption of the family and the modernizing state initiatives in Sweden of the kind of early post-war period, where they were using architecture to try and define family life and using childcare arrangements and the way that schools were operating to split the generations within families apart. So I kind of, was it a very, I suppose my question is, was it you know, an incredibly contemporary, a reflection of contemporary times, or is the emphasis more to be put on, as some other people have said, that it's a kind of prediction of today in terms of nudge and behavioral science and whatever, and possibly both, obviously. But Helene, do you just want to pick up on anything fairly quickly so I can come back out to the audience again?
So very quickly, yes. I mean, I'm very down on Skinner. I've been so bored with him for so long, and he irritates me so much. But you're right in some senses. I mean, he sort of says when he discusses the overlap between his book and Walden, he says, well, you know, what we have in common is that we say, if you don't like society in which you live, change it. You know, that's good. There's something positive there. He, you know, making housework a lot more efficient, you know, is something that is desirable. Ensuring that people don't have to work so many hours, so working 4 hours a day. And I think, you know, in America, that have a real work culture, which is a little bit empty, I would say. You know, that's maybe something you'd say, well, it's a positive aspiration, isn't it? To want to work less, to make house work more efficient. But like a lot of these sort of communities, I think the real problem with it is he wants to, you know, remove it from civilization, cut yourself off from civilization. And then it becomes completely static and dull, because I think humans removed from history just are, as Lash shows, you know, unanchored. And without tradition, you know, you don't become fully human as a result. On the parenting thing, yes, I remember myself arguing that why should, you know, families have to raise them? Why don't we do it communally? But there is something that's lost in that, isn't there? And then that is that intimacy, that and that human connection, which is so important for us, love and intimacy, and through the family. But, you know, I'm not saying I'm ruling out any other way in which human might organize things, but at least the family allows for that development of that strong love between the child and the parents, and the parental, having that parental judgment. And I wouldn't argue you have to be a parent to fully develop as a human being, but adults, through taking responsibility for raising the next generation, is an important part of our human development. On the CBT issue, I always, you know, when I was a student, I always thought behaviorism can all just be thrown into the dustbin of history, but maybe there's some element to which, you know, the therapeutic side, that some of it may work. So behavior therapy, some of it, you know, with some phobias, if you have certain phobias that you think you need to get over because they're getting in your way of functioning, with some of the phobias, you know, flooding, for instance, but if you take spiders, I don't think you need to get rid of that phobia. But, you know, if somebody has an irrational phobia about spiders, his behavior therapy would be to expose them to spiders on a gradual way so that they don't actually die of a heart attack. But some of these therapies did work, but it quickly became, I don't think very many people now go with behavior therapy. It's cognitive behavior therapy, because they realized that you can't remove the mind. You know, the mind has to come into it. So.
Okay, let's leave it there just now, and I'll come back out, and then we can come back for more. So Tom, I'm going to unmute you now, or maybe it's Rosie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on, there's a real contrast between health and progress and everything else to do with humanity. And I just find that interesting. So in Brave New World, the savage says he doesn't want comfort. I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. And then the controller says, so you also want the right to grow ugly, old, impotent, to have syphilis, cancer, too little to eat, to be lousy, and to live in constant apprehension of what might happen tomorrow, and the right to catch typhoid, etc. So there's that very stark contrast between having a healthy, comfortable life, and then having a whole human life. But I find that interesting. The time Brave New World was written, the time Walden 2 was written, but I'm also reading about broader attitudes to health emergencies, so compared to today, and how there was just a sort of acceptance they were a fact of life. There wasn't the sort of focus, intense worry about those real threats to health in society around at the time these books were being written. So I just flagging that really, because it just interests me, and it was interesting to hear Helene is saying this. He only was selling 700 copies a year when it first came out. So something's obviously happened between the book coming out and the 70s and then now, in terms of how we deal with the issue of health as part of human progress and human experience.
Okay, I'm going to now bring in my co-host, Jeff Kidder, who's been waiting patiently. Jeff, can you unmute yourself? Yes, off you go, Jeff.
It's just a quick point. It may be such a banal point, but when Helene is describing these socially engineered futures, and you look at Orwell or Huxley, and they're presenting this dystopia, which is really terrible, and you expect it to be really terrible, whereas Skinner's trying to present as good as it gets, this utopia. And it isn't the fact that his utopia, which he's presenting as this brilliant thing, is very much as you described, i.e. there's no privacy, it's at best banal, there's no education, nothing to feed the mind. Isn't that a useful thing to show how any socially, if this is as good as a socially engineered future, how limited it is? It also, following on from Alistair's point, on the point about Sweden, certainly when I grew up in the 70s and started getting involved in politics, questions about socialization of childcare, communal living, all these things were highly fashionable in a way that they're much less fashionable now. And they were seen as progressive, left-wing and whatever. And I'm not saying they come from Skinner, but you can see that those ideas, wherever they came from and went through Skinner, had quite a strong purchase. And the other final thing is just in terms of the novel, yes, it's not a classic novel. I saw Winston put on the chat that it's barely a novel at all. But you could argue that I run a book club, and if we hadn't discussed it here today, it would be a great discussion to have at the book club, because there's so much in it. There's so many different points of view. There's an argument. Yes, a lot of them are ideas which are very much of their time, in the 1940s and all the rest of it. But it would lead, as this has led this hour here, to a very interesting discussion. So even in those terms, there's a certain merit to reading it and discussing it.
Thanks, Jeff. I sort of share that view of the book as a very useful one, I think. Claire, I'm going to bring you in next. Off you go.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. So one of the things that, one thing I say about Skinner is he's ahead of his time. I mean, we're all saying it describes now. So what you could say is he had his finger on the pulse, if you see what I mean. He describes, we don't like it as a dystopia. A lot of people would think, oh, you know, he's describing the world as we're in, as all the chat says. But also that shows some insight at the very least. Not even so much, not so much that he created it, but he was certainly able to sum up what it feels like living in a kind of technocratic society. And I think that's, as it were, to his credit, all worth noting. I think that one of the things that's most frightening about it is his presentism, and his presentism is without the past, and we know what that would mean in today's circumstances, just where we are completely alienated from history. We find it frightening, but everybody else is trying to do it, if you see what I mean. Sorry, I'm in a room with somebody else who's in a different group. So, anyway, right, so clear now. I did also think that Jason made a good point, which is just on the positive thing, which is he was, after all, trying. The one thing you can say is in that technocracy, he's talking about a more efficient society, and as in distinction from an irrational organisation of society around the market, and talks about how you could centrally plan. Well, you know, I've been known to go along with those ideas myself on occasion. So, you know, I think that there's something in it. What he's absolutely useless on is humans, which gets me to my main point. I'm trying to work out, so that I don't end up throwing psychology out, why psychologists don't understand humanity. I mean, Skinner is quite good on some things, but when it comes to human motivation, he doesn't seem to have a clue. And this actually is rather similar to the behaviourists in SAGE, who have spent the whole of their time trying to work out what humans would do in certain circumstances, and completely not understanding anything about human motivation at all and getting it wrong. So, you know, I would have more sympathy with behavioural psychologists if they understood anything about human behaviour. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, Helena. And so I suppose, for me, psychology is an underestimated field of importance, because I do think that although we want to retain agency in the individual, there is nothing wrong with trying to understand human behaviour. Surely it's actually a noble thing to do. And there are traits that you can understand. There are things that you might be able to understand as a group. So how do I balance it that the psychologists which we're discussing today are useless at understanding human behaviour, but psychology as a science should be one which any humanist could deploy without destroying individuals, but to understand groups and human behaviour would be something we should aspire to doing well. And there are psychologists who have and do. So that's it.
Okay, thanks. But let's go to Joel Mills next. So Joel.
Yeah, I did kind of find the book enjoyable in parts, but a lot of it was a labour to read, especially with the dialogue. But I was also fascinated with the sort of relationship between the utopian and sort of dystopian communities, and or the communities in the hope of being utopian that often turn out to be dystopian, and looking into and thinking about the reasons why. The other aspects that I found really interesting was, and Helen, you mentioned it, about the free will determinism in the book, particularly at the end where Boris returns to the community. You know, he's sort of agonised and seen all the dialogue, and then somebody says to him, "Oh, Fraser knew that you would come back," as if there was kind of no choice, even though that didn't seem to, and I couldn't quite work out the relationship, and I'd love to hear more about that, about the sort of free will determinism and the sort of behavioural psychology. I thought it was also interesting, that whole area of sort of relinquishing of freedom and the sort of active citizenship, you know, this notion for the greater good, and, you know, as Kant would say, that sort of treating people as a mean to an end. Yeah, I sort of feel uneasy about, you know, I kind of like the idea that people are setting about to create some communities and experimenting on how things will work. But the idea of a lot of communities, I mean, there was the batter factory in Essex, which created a community around the shoe factory in the 1930s, and the sort of, you know, the whole kind of social time, leisure time was kind of provided for in this community. Eventually it fell apart. But there's also something about that idea of dropping out of society, conveying the notion that people can't really change and don't feel that they have agency to change the society they're in and have to remove themselves. One last thing I wanted to sort of ask was just about how you think these ideas are sort of being played out today. There was a recent TV series, I don't know if anyone's seen it, called Devs, that drew very much at the heart of it is this sort of free will determinism set in kind of Silicon Valley, the idea that you're on a track that can't change, and there's this desperation of the, I suppose, the protagonists or the heroes in the film to actually try and change that. And I thought it was an interesting sort of parallel and way of seeing that sort of, those same arguments sort of coming out now.
Okay, thanks, Joel. Helena, if I can, I'm just going to keep you till the end, if that's okay, and try and give you a decent 5 minutes at the end to come back on everything. So let's keep going with the contributions. So Nancy, I'm going to come to you next.
Thanks. I was always very skeptical of psychology, but I've really come to appreciate it over the last few years, because the most valuable thing for me about psychology is that it does show you how the mind works, and it shows that that you don't need to have to instrumentalize things, because people naturally take on culture, they naturally form bonds, they naturally do all these things if you allow them to do them, if that makes any sense. And I just, the question I wanted to ask is about the instrumentalization of human relationships, because you know, what makes that possible? Is it just the fear of the irrationality of the Second World War, or what? And I just wanted to say that I think that that has carried through right to the present moment, where it's almost like, if you look at child rearing now, it's all about disrupting any spontaneous interactions and relationships that kids have, either with one another or with their parents or with anyone else. So, you know, socialized childcare, I think the question you have to ask is, are kids allowed to play? Because they aren't now, because adults are constantly intervening and stopping them from having spontaneous interactions. And the last thing I would say is, and the most disturbing thing, is that I think that what's happened is that even something as fundamental as love has been instrumentalized, because it is love now, not obligation, not commitment, that holds families together. And so everything is based on that emotional bond, which is why I think there's so much fear of negative emotions, because you want to use that as the peg to hang everything on. And like Helena, the point Helena made, I thought was really good, is that when you have only happy emotions, you don't really have intimacy.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. So Tamandra.
I admit I haven't actually read the book, but I am a little familiar with some of Skinner's work in psychology. And I just wanted to make what's probably an obvious point, that the behaviorist approach, the idea that the only thing that matters is what you can outwardly measure, i.e. behavior, not the internal subjective processes of the mind, is a completely natural fit for kind of technology with which we interact all the time, and the digital technologies, and the idea that, I mean, it's almost become a cliche to say that the things we interact with on our phones and all the things we click are kind of designed to keep us doing whatever the people that design the app wants to do, whether it's going back to click or clicking on adverts and so on. But that they're not always necessarily sinister. I mean, obviously, if you're running a business, you want people to keep doing the thing that is your business model. But in fact, a lot of the Silicon Valley tech people who design the apps are in their own way quite utopian. There's a big emphasis on health and well-being, especially mental health, and designing things that can track your actual behavior, like how fast you type, what kind of words you use, how far you travel, how far you move. I mean, until recently, how far you move correlated quite well with whether you were getting depressed, for example. And so there's a lot of this technology designed to track human behavior in order to predict and avert mental ill health. And so I think, I mean, this is obviously partly inevitable. If you design technology, you can only deal with things that can be objectively measured and quantified. You can't actually get a direct line into somebody's internal subjective processes. But that does make it a very natural fit for a behaviorist psychological model of how humans work. So whether or not you completely buy the idea that we don't have free will, that the self is an illusion, in practice, what happens is the more we relate to the world through technology, the more we relate through our outward measurable behavior, and the more that becomes a driving factor, even in social policy, because the more we relate to even institutions and authorities through that technology, the more important that becomes, and even our relationships with each other.
Thanks, Tamandra. So I'm going to bring in Paul as the final comment, and then I'm going to bring Helena back in for responses to anything, but really just a kind of few final thoughts, Helena. So Paul.
Thanks. I was just thinking about some of the behaviorism stuff, and it reminded me of the kind of experiments I did where they were trying to prove that free will didn't exist. I think these were Benjamin Libby or something. So in these, they weigh you up and monitor your brain and monitor you with a computer, and they just say, okay, move your hand whenever you want to. And then through this, they found that the signals to move your hand appeared before you were aware of it, and before you were aware of wanting to move your hand. And then they said, okay, this proves there's no free will. But those sorts of things aren't really all that surprising. If you take the top of someone's head off and look inside, you'll see an animal brain. We are animals, so you do have an animal brain that's in there. It's just that there's an awful lot more in there as well. I mean, we have consciousness, but we're not always using it. I find myself, if I'm just wandering around the shops, they can advertise to me, and it can go in, and I'll go, oh, maybe I want to buy this toothpaste or something. But equally, I can say, oh, later on I can think about it and say, no, I don't want to. When I'm reflecting on things. So we have an animal brain. I think that's why, you know, in part things like behaviorism and nudge can work to a point, but they don't reflect, you know, all of human capability. So because they miss that bit, I suppose my question is, does that not mean then that trying to produce a society like Walden 2 is doomed to failure? You can't do it because it doesn't, all of that behaviorism doesn't reflect what a human being is. So although the behaviorists can make things worse, and you know, the sage scientists, when they get it wrong, can make things worse, you can't actually produce a society based on that, because it's just way too messy, and it simply won't work. So maybe we don't need to worry too much about people trying to do this to us right now. I mean, they might be able to do it by coercion, but you can't produce a society based on that, because that's not how we are.
Thanks, Paul. There's been some incredibly useful questions and comments. I think it's actually been a very good discussion, and lots of good comments in the chat as well, including Wiston's point, if anybody wants to just go back to that, because it's quite useful. But Helena, I want to bring you in back now, just to summarize, really, respond to anything that you feel the need to respond to, and just give us a couple of thoughts to take away with ourselves, with us. Okay?
Yeah. I agree with Paul. That's why I said 1984 and George Orwell. It's hard to break the human spirit and to destroy freedom. So I don't think it would succeed. I agreed with Jeff that, you know, if this is the best that social engineering can give us, then it's not exactly very inspiring. On Claire, why do psychologists not understand humans? Well, you've got to differentiate between behaviorists and others. And there is a lot of interesting research within psychology, and not all psychologists are deterministic. Okay, so I think psychology has taught us quite a lot. Psychology has shown us that not all of our decisions are rational, not all of our decisions are conscious. I would say, I know I'm going on to Picard here, but I would say, yes, you know, there are a lot of things that manipulate us, but I do not think they do that in a sinister way in which we are not aware. We are aware of a lot of them, but some of them we just don't think matter. Doesn't matter if you're manipulated to buy particular brands of things when there are 20 different brands. You don't want to use your conscious effort to make a decision. And, you know, so people say, oh, I got taken in by bog off again or whatever. So, you know, to some extent we can be manipulated. I think psychology has shown us, you know, Freud has shown us that we adopt defense mechanisms in order not to confront, you know, real fundamental fears and conflicts that we have internally. Yeah, psychology has shown that to some extent we can be manipulated. It has shown, you know, some of human flaws, that we have cognitive biases. You know, cognitive psychologists I think has shown us quite a lot of some of our limitations in terms of cognitive biases, but these are also useful way for us to interact and make sense of the world. The fact that we prejudge, we don't always make conscious, rational decisions. We often prejudge, but that's just a way in which to engage with the world. We have a limited ability to pay attention. There are all kinds of flaws, I think, the psychology has shown us. So for instance, there's a fantastic experiment that shows you're asked to count how many times the basketball is bounced. And you're watching it and you're desperately trying to count how many times the basketball is bounced. And afterwards you're asked, did you see the human gorilla suited guy walking in amongst? And I didn't see it. I was absolutely convinced that was not the video that I saw. You don't see a guy in a gorilla suit walking through the basketball players because you're so busy counting. There are other experiments that show how sometimes how poor we are at paying attention, that show how memory can be manipulated. These things I think are quite important for the criminal justice system in terms of thinking about things like, you know, how reliable are witnesses. There's a fascinating book by Matthew Said called Black Box Thinking that looks at how the aviation industry is so safe now in comparison to other sectors, because it's always based on black box thinking. You look at the black box, you learn from the mistake, you don't point fingers, but you work out why did the pilot make the mistake that they did. So one thing they've learned that in periods, in conditions of extreme stress, we lose our capacity to tell how much, the speed of time. So an airline pilot, the one engine breaks, and he's told he's got 5 minutes of fuel left. He says, right, just let me spend 1 minute to see if I could restart this engine. And people try to interrupt him. He spends 20 minutes and the airplane crashes, yeah? So they put things in place then. So I would say, you know, these kind of things are quite useful because you can learn from them and then you can make flying more safe. But I wouldn't say, oh my God, no, do not take away the autonomy and the ability to make a judgment and undermine the professional autonomy of a pilot by introducing these bells and warning systems. Because I think, you know, if we know that under extreme stress humans fail, then you put other measures in place. If we know that humans are manipulated, you know, in terms of advertising, it might not, you know, maybe it doesn't really matter. But where it does matter, I think, is when it comes to democracy, politics, parental autonomy, professional autonomy more broadly, that we really would need to argue against measures being put in place that minimize and reduce human beings' ability to exercise judgments and make decisions. I wanted to just perhaps finish with a quick quote. Have I got time from...
One minute left.
Quote from John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World, because this struck me so much. So the armoured car troops, there was a discussion about whether they should remain neutral. And the argument that they'd been convinced by was that they should remain neutral. And as Reed says, whoever controlled the armoured car troops controlled the city. So this is, you know, at 1917, Petrograd, St. Petersburg. A Bolshevik speaker, stood up and argued that if you remain neutral, you will allow the Junkers and the death battalions to slaughter the Red Army. Yet he went into more arguments than that. But Reed here says, never have I seen men trying so hard to understand, to decide, their brows wrinkled, the sweat pouring with the effort of thought. For the moment they were lifted out of the ordinary run of common thought, thinking in terms of Russia, socialism, and the world. So common people who'd never had to seriously think about decisions suddenly had to think about, do we take sides, which could have repercussions not just for Russia and the world. And when he's basically showing how when they are in that position, they rise above, a head above where they were. So we need to put emphasis on where it matters. Human judgment and decision has to be upheld. Where it doesn't matter in advertising, I really don't care. Let them manipulate us.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helene. I was so pleased when we got you to do this, because I knew that you'd bring a kind of depth of knowledge of psychology, but also a political overview to this. And that's exactly what you've brought. That was really fantastic. So I'm going to unmute everyone now, and we're going to clap you.